My name is Tamar Meyer, and I am the director of the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs. I'm also one of the co-organizers of the conference, along with Mark Williams, professor in the Political Science Department and the director of Latin American Studies track in IGS. Mark, where are you? So people can say hi to you. Mark? He's getting coffee? He will come. Eddie Vesquez, professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture. Eddie, I saw you. Okay, here's Eddie. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, and particularly all of you who braved the March nor'easter, to be with us here today at Middlebury. Thank you all for coming. This conference is the 6th annual conference. It's an international and interdisciplinary conference organized and hosted by the Rohatyn Center. You can see the themes of the previous 5 conferences and that of next year's on the back of their programs. The annual conference highlights the work that the center does by providing an occasion for showcasing all aspects of the missions, of our missions, in ways that individual lectures simply cannot. The focus of the annual conference is global and international by design. Those conferences often delve deeply and critically into topics that can be discussed from multiple disciplinary perspectives in ways really that enrich the curriculum of the program in international global studies and the intellectual life of the college as a whole. This year's topic is no exception. With us today are scholars who will explore with us the hopes that the year 1968 brought and the revolution that never really came to fruition. Our guest speakers are interested in ways that the events that took place during the 1960s continue to reverberate into the present, with lessons that can be learned from that tumultuous decade. For indeed, it was the events of the entire decade that changed modern history, but one year, 1968, stands out as the decade's watershed, because it was then that the optimistic and the destructive trajectories of the entire period intersected most dramatically. As you walked into this hall today, the Beatles song Revolution was playing. It was composed by John Lennon in 1968 and very much represents the image that many have had of that year. The song was written in response to several violent protests that took place in 1968, including massive anti-Vietnam protests on college campuses in the US and in the streets of London. In France, students and workers protested the old political order, and indeed more than 10 million, 22% of the total population, went on strike for 2 continuous weeks, occupying French universities and factories and almost bringing down the government. These demonstrations were orchestrated primarily by young people, mostly baby boomers, who rose up against the post-World War II power structure in the West, hoping to dismantle a political, economic, and social system that they regarded as unjust. They took to the streets of major cities and around the world, demonstrating against capitalism, American imperialism, and the consumerism that followed in its wake. At the same time, there were demonstrations in Eastern Europe, from Poland to Yugoslavia, that focused on freedom of speech and the violation of civil rights by the communist authorities. Earlier in the 60s, anti-colonial national liberation movements had succeeded in achieving independence. In sub-Saharan Africa, in 1960 alone, 17 states became independent of France. When the Algerian National Liberation Front emerged victorious in its fights against French colonial oppression, their success became an inspiration, almost a blueprint, for the birth of groups like the Black Panthers, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Irish Republican Army, and others. As the decade advanced, however, political optimism waned, with events such as the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Prague Spring, Mao's brutal cultural revolution, the outbreak of the troubles in Northern Ireland, Tlatelolco, in the Tlatelolco massacre of students and civilians by police in Mexico City, just 10 days before the Olympics, and the defeat of guerrilla insurgencies in Latin America by Latin American dictators, epitomized by the execution of Ernesto Che Guevara in October of 1967. In the US, the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy and the election of Richard Nixon as president of 1968 were also were markers of the sea change. Yet at the same time, against the backdrop of the Cold War and the ubiquitous violent conflicts everywhere, the decade gave rise to the civil rights movement, the women's movement. This is second wave feminism, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, and the environmental movement, generating a sense of hope and progress as well. Starting with the Summer of Love in 1967, many young people chose to leave the cities, rejecting technologies and rejecting technology and establishment politics and seeking alternative communities in nature. The utopian impulse expressed itself in the many outdoor festivals that took place toward the end of the decade, which enabled many of the young participants to enact their vision of a liberated counterculture. On both the personal and the political level then, the decade's movements shifted paradigms of social justice and individual freedoms in ways that have continued to resonate. But in spite of advances in political justice on some fronts and an expansion in the range of political lifestyle choices, how much difference the putatively cataclysmic year 1968 really made is an open question. Over the next 2 days, the scholars assembled here will explore the meaning of 1968 in different parts of the world. They will address how authority, legitimacy, and power were exercised and challenged in the political, economic, social, and cultural realms, and will offer their thoughts about what we can learn from 1968, now 50 years later. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to offer some thank yous. There are several people that did a lot of work behind the scene, and they need to be recognized publicly. First, Charlotte Tate. Where are you, Charlotte? Charlotte Tate, who did a lot of the work. Many of you participants don't even know how much, and you just met her this afternoon. I also like to thank Jennifer Nusider, right there, our coordinator, for making all the arrangements associated with the conference before the nor'easter and during the storm. Only those of you who came here, who traveled more than 24 hours, know how much work she's done. And lastly, I want to thank Carlos Cariza. Where are you, Carlo? He's the center's outreach fellow. He's the outreach fellow who prepared all the posters, the programs, and all the materials that you have in your hands and that you will have later in the afternoon when you come and join us up the hill. And lastly, I would like to thank again my co-organizers, Professor Williams and Vasquez. Thank you really all very, very much. I would like to express my gratitude to the Rohatyn Center Faculty Steering Committee and the Center's Student Advisory Board for their input, and to the following departments and programs that co-sponsored the conference, and the list is long. Department of English and American Literatures, Lois 51 and J. Harvey Watson Department of French and Francophone Studies, Department of Geography, Department of History, Department of History of Art and Architecture, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Program in Gender, Sexuality, Feminist Studies, International Programs and Off-Campus Studies, and Brainerd Commons.